the Vice President of the United States, had a secret wife he never freed. She managed his empire, bore his children, lived like a partner, but died as a slave. And after his death, her story was deliberately destroyed. This is the woman America tried to forget. No one knows exactly when Julia Chin was born, not the year, not the season, not even the day her first breath broke into the world. Some say 1,790. Others say closer to 1,796, maybe 1,797. But for a girl born into slavery, precision was a luxury no one bothered to keep, because to them she wasn't a person worth recording, she was property. The land that shaped her life was Kentucky raw, expanding, restless, a place where forests were still being cut down, where settlements were fragile, and where the rules of society were still forming. But one rule was already clear. Slavery was legal, normal, expected. Men owned land, men owned animals, and men owned people. Julia was one of them. She was born on the plantation of the Johnson family, in the rolling bluegrass region, a place that looked peaceful from afar. Green fields, wide skies, quiet mornings broken only by the sound of wind brushing through tall grass. But beneath that calm surface was a system built on control and suffering. Her mother, Henrietta, was an enslaved woman. That was the only certainty Julia inherited at birth. Not a name she chose, not a future she could shape, just a condition she could never escape. There were whispers, quiet, unconfirmed, about her father, a free white man. No one said his name out loud, no one wrote it down, but his existence lingered in the details people couldn't ignore. Julia's skin was lighter than many others on the plantation, her features different. Not enough to change her fate, but enough to mark her as something complicated, something that didn't quite belong anywhere. In Kentucky at the time, lines between races existed, but they blurred in practice more than people admitted. White settlers, enslaved Africans, free black communities, Native American tribes, all living in uneasy proximity. And from that tension, people like Julia were born, caught between worlds, accepted by none. Her childhood was not marked by milestones, but by hunger. Meals were never enough. Cornmeal stretched thin. Vegetables grown in small patches of land, the enslaved were allowed to tend for themselves. Beans, cabbage, potatoes. No meat most days, no strength for growing bodies, just survival. The adults worked the fields from sunrise to exhaustion. Children were not spared. They carried water, gathered scraps, learned early that rest was not something guaranteed. Julia grew up watching her mother move like a shadow across the land, quiet, efficient, always tired. There was no room for weakness, because weakness meant punishment, or worse, being sold. And that fear was always there, unspoken, but understood. At any moment, a family could be broken apart. A mother taken one way, a child sent another. No explanation, no warning, just absence. Julia learned quickly not to ask questions. Not about her father, not about her future, because in that world, questions didn't lead to answers. They led to disappointment or silence. She did not grow up dreaming of freedom, because freedom was not something she had ever seen. It was a word that belonged to other people, people who looked different, lived differently, and moved through the world without permission. Instead, Julia learned something else: how to endure, how to observe, how to exist in a place where your life could be decided by someone else's mood, someone else's need, someone else's ambition. The Johnson family, her owners, were not poor. They were among the early settlers pushing westward, claiming land, building influence. Men like them were shaping the future of Kentucky, mapping it, owning it, controlling it. And people like Julia were part of that expansion, not as citizens, but as tools. There were many children on the plantation. Some laughed, some cried, but none of them truly understood the system they were born into. Not yet. That understanding came later, slowly, painfully, as they grew old enough to realize something was missing: choice. Julia's early years passed without ceremony. No birthdays, no celebrations. Just days blending into each other, marked only by labor and survival. But something about her life was already different. Not visible, not obvious. But quietly, inevitably, she was being pulled closer to the center of the Johnson family. Closer to power. Closer to a man whose name would one day be known across the entire country. And when that moment came, when Julia Chin was taken from everything she knew and placed into his household, her life would change forever. Not into freedom, not into safety, but into something far more dangerous. A life where she would be seen, recognized, and still never truly belong. And it all began before she even had the chance to choose who she wanted to become. Julia Chin grew up in a world where nothing truly belonged to her, not her time, not her body, not even her future. Every movement she made was watched, every task assigned, every mistake remembered. The plantation was not just a place of labor, it was a system designed to shape obedience from the moment a child could walk. Children like Julia learned early that survival depended on silence, on reading moods, and on staying invisible when necessary and useful when required. There were no lessons about dreams, only lessons about endurance. She watched the older enslaved men and women carefully, how they lowered their eyes, how they spoke only when spoken to, how they carried exhaustion like a second skin. It was not taught in words, but in consequences. A wrong look could lead to punishment. A moment of defiance could mean separation, and separation was the greatest fear of all. Families were fragile, held together not by law but by chance, and that chance could disappear overnight. Julia understood this long before she understood the world beyond the plantation. She stopped asking questions not because she had no curiosity, but because she learned that curiosity had no reward here. Only survival mattered. As she grew older, something else began to change. People started noticing her, not in a way that brought comfort, but in a way that carried weight. Her lighter complexion, her quiet intelligence, the way she observed more than she spoke. These details did not grant her freedom, but they marked her as different. And in a place built on control, being different was never neutral. It meant you would be used differently, watched differently, and eventually chosen for something beyond the fields. Julia did not yet know it, but her life was already shifting beneath her feet. While other children were being shaped for labor in the soil, she was being pulled, slowly and silently, toward the household, toward proximity with power, toward a man whose decisions would define the rest of her life. Richard Mentor Johnson was not yet the figure history would remember, but within the plantation, his presence already carried authority, and soon Julia would be taken from the only world she understood and placed into his, a move that would not free her, but bind her in a way far more complicated than chains. The moment Julia Chin was taken away from her mother did not come with warning, explanation, or choice. It happened the way things often did on a plantation, quietly, suddenly, and without regard for what it would break. One day, she was still within reach of the only person who had ever meant safety to her, and the next, she was being sent somewhere else, into a different part of the Johnson family's world. Separation was not rare, but that did not make it any less devastating. There were no goodbyes that lasted long enough, no promises that could be trusted, only the understanding that once you were moved, things would never return to what they were. Julia did not cry the way younger children did. She had already learned that emotion had no value here. Instead, she memorized what she could: her mother's face, the sound of her voice, the small routines that made life bearable, because deep down, she knew those memories might be all she would have left. She was sent to Blue Spring Farm, the estate of Richard Mentor Johnson, the youngest son of the family. Unlike the main plantation, this was a place of growing ambition, a household that reflected not just wealth, but a future being carefully constructed. Johnson was no ordinary landowner. He was already building his path into politics, already moving beyond Kentucky in his vision, already becoming a man who understood power not just as ownership, but as influence. And now Julia was entering that world, not as a guest, not as a worker by choice, but as someone placed there for a purpose she did not yet understand. The environment at Blue Spring Farm was different. The expectations were different. This was not just about field labor anymore. This was about proximity, who was seen, who was trusted, who was shaped for roles beyond the soil. Julia quickly realized that she was no longer just another child among many. She was being watched more closely, given tasks that required attention, discipline, and awareness. She was inside the house now, closer to the rhythms of decision-making, closer to conversations she was not meant to fully hear, but could not entirely ignore. She saw how power moved in quiet ways, in how orders were given, in how people responded, in how one man's presence could shift the entire atmosphere of a room. And at the center of it all was Richard Mentor Johnson, around 30 years old, unmarried, and already carrying himself like a man who expected to be followed. He was different from the others Julia had known. He was not just an owner, he was a figure who lived between worlds, Kentucky and Washington, land and politics, private life and public ambition. There were stories about him, about a woman he had once intended to marry, and a decision forced upon him by his family. Stories that suggested he did not easily accept control from others. Whether those stories were true or not, one thing was clear: Johnson made his own choices, and soon, Julia would become one of them. Without asking, without consent, without a way back, her life was no longer just about survival. It was about to become something far more complicated, a role defined not by who she was, but by what someone else decided she would be. At Blue Spring Farm, Julia Chin's world narrowed and expanded at the same time. She was no longer lost among dozens of field hands, no longer just another child moving in the background. Now, every action she took seemed to carry weight. The house demanded a different kind of discipline: quiet footsteps, careful attention, the ability to anticipate needs before they were spoken. She learned quickly, not because she was taught, but because failure was never an option. Inside the household, she witnessed a life that stood in sharp contrast to the one she had known. There were structured meals, organized routines, visitors who arrived dressed in fine clothing, speaking about politics, land, and power. Julia was close enough to observe, but never close enough to belong. She existed in the space between visibility and invisibility, seen when needed, ignored when not. It was in this environment that Richard Mentor Johnson's attention began to settle on her. At first, it was subtle, a longer glance, a question asked directly instead of through another servant, small shifts that others might not notice, but Julia did, because in her world, attention from a man like him was never neutral. It always meant change, and change, more often than not, meant danger. Johnson was a man used to control not just over land or labor, but over the people within his reach. He moved with confidence, spoke with certainty, and expected obedience without question. For Julia, there was no framework to understand what was happening, only an instinctive awareness that her position in the household was shifting again. She was given responsibilities that placed her closer to him, tasks that required her presence in his immediate surroundings, tasks that ensured she would be seen, remembered, and eventually singled out. The other enslaved people noticed it too, though no one spoke openly about it. Silence was a form of survival here, and everyone understood the unspoken rules. When a man like Johnson chose someone, that choice could not be challenged, only endured. Julia felt the change before it was ever acknowledged. There was a tension in the air, a sense that something irreversible was approaching. She could not refuse, she could not escape, she could only continue moving forward, step by step, into a role she did not choose, but would soon be forced to accept. And in that quiet, controlled household, where power was exercised without resistance, the line between servant and something else began to blur. For Julia Chin, the next shift in her life would not come as a question. It would come as a decision already made by someone else. A decision that would bind her to Richard Mentor Johnson in a way that would define the rest of her existence. The transition did not happen all at once. There was no single moment where Julia Chin could point and say, "This was when everything changed." Instead, it unfolded gradually, almost quietly, until there was no longer any space left to step back. What began as proximity became expectation. What felt like attention became control. And before she could fully understand it, Julia was no longer just part of the household. She had become bound to Richard Mentor Johnson in a deeply unequal and unavoidable way. It is difficult to call what followed a relationship in any modern sense, because there was no choice on her side, no freedom to refuse, no power to negotiate, no voice that could alter the outcome Johnson had chosen her, and in the world they lived in, that decision was final. The imbalance between them was absolute. He was a white landowner, a rising political figure, a man whose influence stretched beyond the plantation. She was an enslaved young woman whose life could be redirected at any moment. The difference in age, status, and power made everything unmistakably clear. Yet over time, what existed between them became more complicated than a single label could contain. Julia was no longer treated like the others in certain ways. She was kept close, given responsibilities within the household that reflected trust, or at least reliance, and her presence became a constant in Johnson's daily life. This did not grant her freedom, but it changed how she moved within the space around her. She occupied a position that was neither fully elevated nor fully equal, a place that came with visibility but not security. For those around them, the situation was understood but rarely spoken aloud. The plantation operated on unspoken truths, and this was one of them. No one questioned Johnson's authority, and no one interfered with his decisions. Julia, for her part, adapted the only way she knew how, by observing, by learning, by surviving within the role that had been forced upon her. She learned how to read his moods, how to respond without hesitation, how to exist in a dynamic where her safety depended on maintaining a fragile balance. As time passed, that balance deepened into something that appeared, from the outside, almost like a domestic arrangement. Visitors would come and go, seeing her within the household, noticing her presence, perhaps even sensing the nature of her connection to Johnson. But what they saw was only the surface. Beneath it remained the undeniable reality that Julia Chin was still legally enslaved. No matter how close she stood to power, no matter how central she became to Johnson's life, she did not own herself. And that truth would shape everything that came next, because soon Julia would take on a new role, one that would tie her even more tightly to Johnson, not just through proximity, but through blood, through children, through a bond that could not be undone even if freedom had been offered, and yet, even that would not be enough to change the one fact that defined her existence. She was still, in the eyes of the law, nothing more than property. The first child changed everything. For Julia Chin, it was not just the pain of childbirth or the weight of becoming a mother, it was the realization that her life was now permanently tied to Richard Mentor Johnson in a way that could never be undone. When her daughter, Imogene, was born in 1812, there was no doubt about who the father was. This was not hidden, not denied, not quietly buried the way such truths often were. Instead, Johnson did something unusual for a man in his position. He acknowledged the child openly. Visitors who came to Blue Spring Farm were introduced to Imogene as his daughter, not as a servant's child, not as a secret, but as part of his household. And soon after, a second daughter, Adeline, was born, further cementing the bond between Julia and Johnson. From the outside, it began to resemble something almost unthinkable for that time, a family. Yet even within that fragile structure, the imbalance remained absolute. Julia was still enslaved. Her children, though recognized by their father, existed in a world that would never fully accept them. They carried his name, but not his status. They lived in his house, but not within his protection in the way a lawful family would. The contradiction was constant and unavoidable. Johnson's behavior only deepened that contradiction. He referred to Julia as his wife in certain contexts, a term that blurred the boundaries of their relationship and challenged the social norms of early 19th century Kentucky. But this was not a legal marriage. It could not be. Interracial marriage was forbidden by law, and even if it had been allowed, Julia's status as an enslaved woman made such a union impossible. So what existed between them was something undefined, part recognition, part possession, part defiance of society, yet still bound by its rules. Within the walls of Blue Spring Farm, Julia's role continued to evolve. She was no longer just a presence in Johnson's life. She was central to it. She cared for their children, managed aspects of the household, and maintained a level of order that reflected both her capability and her necessity. Johnson trusted her in ways that were rare for an enslaved woman, but that trust did not translate into freedom. It only reinforced her position within the structure he controlled. For Julia, motherhood brought both connection and deeper vulnerability. She now had more to lose. Her children became her world, but they also became another reason she could not risk resistance, could not challenge the system that held them all in place. Everything she did, every decision she made, was shaped by the need to protect them in whatever limited way she could. And so, what might have appeared from the outside as a life of unusual privilege was, in reality, a life defined by contradiction. She was closer to power than most enslaved people could ever imagine, yet still entirely without it. She was acknowledged, yet not recognized. She was needed, yet not free. And as Johnson's political ambitions continued to grow, carrying him further into the public eye and deeper into the structures of American power, Julia remained behind the scenes, holding together a life that could never fully belong to her or to the children she was raising. As Richard Mentor Johnson's political career began to expand beyond Kentucky, Julia Chinn's role inside Blue Spring Farm became even more critical. He was no longer just a landowner managing a plantation. He was a man moving between worlds, spending months at a time in Washington, involved in decisions that reached far beyond his land. And every time he left, the responsibility of maintaining everything behind him did not disappear. It shifted to Julia. She was the one who ensured the plantation continued to function, the one who dealt with workers, with supplies, with the constant flow of tasks that kept the estate alive. She oversaw the daily operations, handled transactions with those who came to buy goods, and maintained order in a system that was never truly stable. This level of responsibility was rare for an enslaved woman, but it did not change her status. It only increased her burden. Alongside managing the plantation, she was also responsible for raising their daughters. Imogene and Adeline were not raised like other enslaved children. Johnson had plans for them. He ensured they were educated, bringing in a local minister, Thomas Henderson, to teach them reading, writing, and proper behavior skills that set them apart from others in their position. Julia played a central role in this, not only as their mother, but as someone who understood the importance of preparing them for a world that would judge them harshly. Despite this, their place in society remained uncertain. They carried their father's name, but not his full acceptance. They were acknowledged, but not equal. And Julia knew that everything she was building for them existed on fragile ground. Within the social life of Blue Spring Farm, Julia also took on a visible role. When Johnson returned from Washington, the plantation became a space of gatherings, meetings, and political conversations men of influence visited, discussing land, policy, and power in rooms where Julia was present but never fully included. She organized these events, ensured everything ran smoothly, and even contributed to the atmosphere. She was known to play the piano, adding a level of refinement that surprised many who encountered her for the first time. From the outside, it could appear as though Julia occupied a position close to equality within the household. She managed finances when Johnson was away, handled responsibilities that required trust, and maintained a presence that was both essential and respected. But this appearance was deceptive because beneath all of it remained a single, unchanging truth. She was still legally enslaved. Every decision she made, every role she fulfilled, every moment of authority she exercised existed only because it had been allowed. It could be taken away at any time, and that underlying reality shaped everything. Even as she moved through the house with confidence, even as she directed others and maintained control over the estate, there was always a limit she could not cross. A boundary that reminded her, no matter how central she had become to Johnson's world, she did not belong to it on her own terms. She belonged to him. And as his influence continued to grow, so too did the complexity of her position, caught between visibility and invisibility, power and powerlessness, recognition and erasure. One of the most revealing chapters of Julia Chinn's life came through something few would expect from a plantation run by an enslaved woman, the creation of a school at Blue Spring Farm. A boarding institution known as the Choctaw Academy was established, designed to educate Native American boys from different tribes. It was an unusual project, one that reflected both the expanding influence of the United States and the complex relationships between settlers and indigenous communities. But behind its daily operation, behind the structure that kept it functioning, was Julia. She was not just maintaining a household anymore, she was helping manage an institution. Students arrived from distant regions, bringing with them different languages, customs, and expectations. The responsibility of feeding them, organizing their routines, and ensuring the school operated smoothly fell, in large part, under her control. She worked alongside Thomas Henderson, the same minister who educated her daughters, extending that structure of learning beyond her own family and into something larger. This role further elevated her importance within Blue Spring Farm. It showed a level of trust that was rarely given to someone in her position. She was not simply following orders, she was coordinating, supervising, and sustaining a system that required consistency and discipline. Visitors who came to see the academy or to meet with Johnson could not ignore her presence. She was visible in a way that challenged expectations, moving through spaces that enslaved women were not typically associated with. And yet, even here, the contradiction remained. The school itself was part of a broader system of control, an attempt to reshape Native American youth according to American values, to integrate them into a society that was steadily displacing their own. In a similar way, Julia's role within it reflected both agency and limitation. She was active, capable, and essential, but still not free. There were also tensions beneath the surface. Managing people who did not fully accept her authority was an ongoing challenge. Some of the enslaved workers resisted her instructions, seeing her as no different from themselves, despite her elevated role. White employees, at times, ignored her position altogether, unwilling to take direction from an enslaved woman, even when Johnson explicitly ordered them to do so. This created a constant strain, forcing Julia to navigate a fragile balance between authority and vulnerability. She had responsibility without full control, power without recognition, expectation without protection. Despite everything she managed, everything she sustained, her position remained dependent on one man's decision. And that dependency meant that no matter how capable she proved herself to be, no matter how central she became to the functioning of Blue Spring Farm and the Choctaw Academy, she could never claim ownership over the life she was holding together. She was building something that could outlast her efforts, shaping lives beyond her own, yet her own existence remained bound by the same unchanging truth. She was still enslaved, and as the years passed, that truth would begin to press harder against the fragile structure she had maintained, exposing cracks that no amount of strength or intelligence could fully repair. By the 1820s, Julia Chin's presence at Blue Spring Farm had become impossible to ignore. She was no longer just a figure behind the scenes, no longer someone whose role could be dismissed or overlooked. She stood at the center of the household, managing its operations, raising Johnson's children, and maintaining a structure that allowed everything around her to function smoothly. To visitors, especially those unfamiliar with the deeper realities of plantation life, it could appear as though she occupied a position close to that of a wife. She hosted gatherings, interacted with guests, and contributed to the refined atmosphere expected in a household tied to a rising political figure. Her ability to play the piano, to organize events, and to carry herself with composure challenged many assumptions people held about enslaved women. And yet, beneath that appearance, the truth remained unchanged. Julia had no legal standing. She could not marry Johnson. She could not claim the title that others might have quietly attributed to her. She could not secure her own freedom or guarantee the future of her children. Everything she had, everything she maintained, existed within a system that could shift without warning. This contradiction became more visible as Johnson's political life expanded further. His reputation extended beyond Kentucky, bringing greater scrutiny to his personal life. His relationship with Julia, once tolerated or ignored within local circles, began to attract criticism in wider political spaces. In a society that was deeply divided along racial lines, his decision to live openly with an enslaved woman and acknowledge their children was seen by many as scandalous. Opponents used it as a point of attack, questioning his character, his judgment, and his place within the political elite. But within Blue Spring Farm, daily life continued under Julia's control. She remained the one who ensured stability, the one who held together a world that existed in constant tension between private reality and public perception. She adapted to the growing pressure in the only way she could, by maintaining order, by fulfilling her role without drawing unnecessary attention, by continuing to exist within the boundaries that had been set for her. Despite the increasing scrutiny, Johnson did not distance himself from her. He continued to acknowledge their daughters, continued to rely on Julia, continued to structure his personal life in a way that defied conventional expectations. But this defiance had limits. It did not extend to granting her freedom. It did not challenge the legal framework that defined her as property. So, as the gap between how Julia was perceived and what she truly was grew wider, the tension within her life deepened. She was seen, yet not recognized, elevated, yet not secure, essential, yet still entirely dependent on the will of a man whose choices defined her existence. And as the world beyond the plantation began to take greater notice of that contradiction, the stability she had built would begin to face pressures that no amount of control within the household could fully contain. The illusion of stability at Blue Spring Farm began to fracture under pressures that Julia Chin could not control. No matter how well she managed the household, no matter how carefully she maintained order, there were forces beyond her reach that slowly exposed the limits of her position. One of the clearest examples of this came through her own family. Julia had managed to bring her brother, Daniel, and his family to the plantation, creating a small circle of familiarity in a life otherwise defined by separation. For a time, it seemed like a rare victory, a moment where she could use her influence to protect those connected to her. But that sense of security did not last. As financial pressures mounted on Johnson, decisions had to be made, and like everything else within the system of slavery, those decisions came at the expense of people. Daniel and his family were sold, removed from the place Julia had worked so hard to secure for them, and sent away without any guarantee of what their future would hold. There was nothing she could do to stop it. No authority she held within the household could override the reality that they were all considered property. The loss was not just emotional, it was a reminder, sharp and unavoidable, that her influence had limits that could not be crossed. At the same time, Julia faced ongoing challenges in maintaining control over the plantation itself. While she had been placed in a position of authority, not everyone accepted it. Enslaved workers sometimes resisted her instructions, seeing her as one of them. Despite her elevated role, they did not always respond to her leadership, creating tension in a system that depended on strict hierarchy. Even more difficult were the reactions of white employees and neighboring men who were unwilling to take direction from an enslaved woman, regardless of Johnson's orders. This left Julia in a constant struggle, forced to assert authority in a space where that authority was not fully recognized. She had responsibility without full support, expectations without protection. Every decision she made carried risk too strict, and she could face backlash from those around her, too lenient, and the system she was tasked with maintaining could begin to break down. This delicate balance required constant awareness, constant adjustment, constant control of both her actions and her emotions. She could not afford to show weakness, but she also could not enforce power in the same way others could. Her position demanded precision, patience, and restraint at all times. And yet, despite everything she managed, everything she held together, there was always the underlying truth that none of it truly belonged to her. The land, the house, the people, even the small moments of connection she tried to build, all of it could be taken away with a single decision. The loss of her brother's family made that reality impossible to ignore. It stripped away any remaining illusion that her role within Blue Spring Farm could protect what mattered to her. It revealed the fragile nature of everything she had built, and forced her to confront a truth she had always known but could never escape. No matter how central she became to Johnson's world, no matter how much responsibility she carried, she remained bound by a system that could undo her life at any moment. And as those cracks continued to widen, it became clear that the stability she had fought to maintain was not something she could rely on. It was something she could only hold together for as long as circumstances allowed. As the years passed, the contradiction at the center of Julia Chin's life became impossible to ignore. Not just for her, but for everyone around her. She lived in a space that looked, from the outside, almost like partnership, yet was built entirely on ownership. She managed the household, raised the children, and maintained the structure that allowed Richard Mentor Johnson to move freely between his private life and his growing political career. But legally, nothing had changed. In 1815, after the death of his father, Johnson came into full legal ownership of Julia, a moment that should have created an opportunity for her freedom. Instead, it reinforced the system that bound her to him. He had the power to emancipate her, to Altherrstatus, to give her a form of independence that matched the role she already held in his life. But he did not. Historians have debated why. Some suggest that freeing her would have weakened the control he had over their relationship. Others point to the legal restrictions of the time, noting that even if she were freed, interracial marriage was prohibited, meaning they could never formalize their union in the eyes of the law. Whatever the reasoning, the outcome remained the same. Julia continued to live in a state of contradiction, treated as essential, yet legally defined as property. This reality shaped every aspect of her existence. It influenced how others saw her, how they interacted with her, and how far her authority could extend. Within the plantation, her role was recognized when it was convenient, but questioned when it challenged established hierarchies. She could organize, manage, and direct, but she could not claim ownership over any decision that truly mattered. Beyond the plantation, the perception was even more complicated. The local community in Kentucky had grown accustomed to the unusual arrangement between Johnson and Julia, tolerating it in public while criticizing it in private. Their relationship did not fit neatly into the expectations of the time, and that discomfort translated into judgment that lingered beneath the surface. Julia was aware of this, even if it was never openly expressed to her. She understood that her position existed outside the boundaries of what society accepted, and that this made her both visible and vulnerable. At the same time, Johnson's continued reliance on her reinforced the importance of her role. He trusted her with responsibilities that went beyond the ordinary, leaving her in charge of finances, operations, and the daily functioning of the estate when he was away in Washington. This level of trust was rare, especially given her legal status, but it did not translate into security. It only deepened the complexity of her situation. She was indispensable, yet replaceable, powerful within a confined space, yet powerless beyond it. As these contradictions continued to define her life, the pressure they created began to build. There was no clear resolution, no path that could reconcile the gap between how she lived and how she was legally defined. Julia existed in that gap, navigating it with strength and precision, but always aware that it could never truly be closed. And as time moved forward, that unresolved tension would lead her toward a final chapter, one that would not only end her life, but also begin the process of erasing her from the history she had quietly helped shape. In the summer of 1833, an invisible threat moved across the American Midwest, cutting through towns, farms, and communities with terrifying speed. Cholera, known at the time as the Blue Death, arrived without warning and left devastation behind it. Within weeks, it spread through Kentucky, reaching places like Blue Spring Farm, where daily life had once followed a fragile but steady rhythm. For Julia Chin, this was not a distant crisis. It was immediate, unavoidable, and deeply personal. The Choctaw Academy, which she had helped manage for years, it became one of the place's hardest hit. Students began falling ill, one after another, their strength fading rapidly as the disease took hold. There was no clear understanding of how it spread, no effective treatment, and very little that could be done beyond basic care. In the face of this, Julia stepped into the role she had always taken on. In times of crisis, she stayed. She cared for the sick, moving between rooms, tending to the children who had been placed under her supervision, doing what she could to ease their suffering. Days blurred into nights as exhaustion set in, but she did not stop. This was not an obligation written into law, but a responsibility she had accepted through years of holding everything together. She had built a system that relied on her, and even in the face of danger, she remained at its center. But cholera did not spare those who cared for others. After weeks of exposure, Julia began to show symptoms herself. What started as weakness quickly escalated into something far more severe. The disease moved fast, draining the body, leaving little time for recovery or resistance. There were no safeguards for her, no special protection despite everything she had done. Within a short time, it became clear that she would not survive. Her life, which had been defined by endurance, control, and constant adaptation, was now reduced to something fragile and fleeting. The woman who had managed an entire plantation, raised children, and sustained an institution, was suddenly powerless against something that could not be negotiated with, controlled, or avoided. Around her, the world she had held together continued to exist, but she was no longer at its center. She was just another victim of a disease that did not recognize status, responsibility, or importance. And in that final stage of her life, the contradiction that had defined her existence remained. She was essential, yet unprotected, visible, yet without recognition, central to everything, yet ultimately alone. As her strength faded, there were no grand acknowledgments, no formal recognition of the life she had lived or the role she had played. There was only the quiet reality of her condition, the inevitability of what was coming, and the absence of anything that could truly change her fate. Julia Chin, who had spent her entire life navigating a system designed to control her, now faced something beyond that system entirely, and this time there was nothing she could do to endure it. Julia Chin's final days came quickly, without the kind of closure her life had never been allowed to have. Cholera did not move slowly or give time for reflection. It stripped the body with brutal efficiency, leaving little room for recovery and even less for farewell. As her condition worsened, the same strength that had carried her through years of responsibility could no longer sustain her. The woman who had once moved through Blue Spring Farm with control and purpose was now confined, weakened, and fading. The children she had cared for, the household she had managed, the system she had held together, all of it continued. But without her guiding presence, there are no detailed records of what was said in those final moments. No written account of her thoughts, no preserved words that could tell us what she felt as her life came to an end. Like so much of her existence, the most intimate parts of her story were never recorded. She died sometime in 1833, likely in her late 30s or early 40s. The exact location of her burial remains unknown. No marked grave, no monument, no official recognition of a life that had been central to so many others. Her passing did not stop the world around. Herr Johnson continued his political career, the plantation continued to operate, and the structures she had maintained remained in place, now carried forward by others. Her absence was real, but it was absorbed into the system with unsettling ease. This was the final contradiction of her life. She had been indispensable, yet her disappearance did not disrupt the system she had sustained. It adapted, as it always did. For those who had known her personally, there may have been grief, perhaps even a sense of loss that could not be openly expressed, but in the broader structure of the society she lived in, there was no space for public mourning of someone in her position. No acknowledgement that matched the scale of her contributions. She passed from life the same way she had lived within it, without full recognition, without control over how her story would be told. And yet, even in death, the consequences of her life remained. Her daughters, Imogene and Adeline, carried forward the legacy of a relationship that defied the norms of their time. They had been raised with a level of care and education that set them apart, yet they too existed within a world that would never fully accept them. Julia's influence continued through them, even as her own presence faded into silence. Her story, already fragile in life, now became even more vulnerable to being lost entirely. Without records, without protection, without anyone to ensure it was preserved, it existed only in fragments, in memories that would eventually fade, in traces that could easily be erased. And as time moved forward, that is exactly what began to happen. The life Julia Chin had lived, complex, contradictory, and deeply intertwined with the history of a powerful man, started to disappear, slipping quietly out of the narrative, leaving behind only questions and fragments for future generations to piece together. After Julia Chin's death, the world she had helped hold together did not pause. It moved on with a quiet, almost unsettling normalcy. Richard Mentor Johnson continued forward, his life defined not by loss, but by ambition and momentum. The absence of Julia, though deeply personal, did not alter the direction of his political career. If anything, it removed a complication that had long existed in the background of his public image. Without her presence, there was no longer a visible contradiction within his household, no immediate reminder of a relationship that had challenged social expectations. For a time, it seemed as though Julia's life would fade completely into obscurity, absorbed into the larger narrative of Johnson's rise. But the patterns that had defined his relationship with her did not disappear, they repeated. In the years following her death, Johnson entered into a similar relationship with another enslaved woman on the plantation. Just as before, the dynamic was shaped by power, control, and dependency. However, this time, the outcome revealed a different side of him. When that woman eventually left him for another man, Johnson did not respond with acceptance or indifference. Instead, he had her captured and sold at auction, a decision that exposed the underlying reality of his authority and the limits of any perceived attachment. The woman's choice to leave was treated not as an act of independence, but as a violation of ownership. Shortly after, Johnson began a similar relationship with her sister, continuing the cycle in a way that made one thing unmistakably clear. Whatever complexity had existed between him and Julia, whatever emotional depth might have been present, it had always existed within a system that gave him absolute control and denied the same to those bound to him. This pattern cast a different light on Julia's life in retrospect. It raised questions about how much of what appeared to be trust or partnership had been shaped by circumstance rather than equality. It suggested that even the most unique aspects of her position were still confined within the same structure that governed every other enslaved person on the plantation. As time moved forward, Johnson's public identity became more prominent than his private life. He was remembered for his political achievements, for his role in shaping early American governance, for his position as vice president. Yet the details of his relationship with Julia Chin, the woman who had lived at the center of his personal world for years, began to fade from the historical record. There were no deliberate efforts at first to erase her, only the gradual process of omission. The absence of documentation, the lack of formal recognition, the tendency of history to focus on power rather than those affected by it, all of these contributed to her story slipping further into the background. Without written records to preserve her voice, without legal acknowledgement to anchor her place in history, Julia became easier to overlook, easier to forget. And in that silence, the foundation was laid for something more intentional, something that would go beyond passive, forgetting, and move toward deliberate erasure, a process that would ensure her story, and the truth it carried, would remain hidden for decades to come. By the time Richard Mentor Johnson reached the height of his political career, the distance between his public image and his private life had grown impossible to ignore. In 1836, as he ran on the national stage alongside Martin Van Buren, his past, especially his relationship with Julia Chin, became a point of controversy that opponents were eager to exploit. In a society deeply divided by race and rigid in its expectations, the idea that a prominent politician had lived openly with an enslaved woman and fathered children with her was not just unusual, it was scandalous. Political attacks began to circulate, not always through official channels, but through pamphlets, caricatures, and whispered conversations meant to damage his reputation. One particularly striking image from that time depicted Johnson alongside his daughters, with a portrait of Julia included her features deliberately exaggerated, her skin tone darkened to provoke ridicule and reinforce racial prejudice. These portrayals were not about truth, they were about perception, about shaping how the public saw him, about turning his private life into a weapon. Despite this, Johnson's political momentum did not collapse. He was elected Vice President of the United States, serving from 1837 to 1841, a position that placed him among the most powerful figures in the country. His rise demonstrated something complex about the era. While his relationship with Julia was controversial, it was not enough to completely derail his career. The same society that criticized him was also willing to accept him, revealing contradictions not unlike those that had defined Julia's own life. Yet within this political success, Julia's absence was absolute. She did not live to see his election, did not witness the culmination of a career she had indirectly supported through years of managing his affairs and sustaining his household. Her role in his life, so central in private, was entirely missing from his public identity. As Johnson stood on the national stage, there was no acknowledgement of the woman who had shared his home, raised his children, and carried responsibilities that allowed him to pursue his ambitions. Her story had already begun to disappear, overshadowed by the narrative of his success and the demands of his position. The further he moved into the world of politics, the less space there was for anything that complicated his image. And Julia, whose existence embodied that complication, became easier to leave behind, not through a single act of erasure, but through a gradual process of exclusion where what was inconvenient was simply not mentioned, not recorded, not preserved. This was how history often worked, not through immediate deletion, but through silence, through choosing what to remember and what to ignore, through allowing certain lives to remain visible, while others faded into the background until they were no longer seen at all. And as Johnson's influence continued to grow, that silence around Julia Chin became deeper, more complete, setting the stage for what would happen after his death, when the process of forgetting would no longer be passive, but intentional. As Richard Mentor Johnson's time in national politics came to an end, the public attention that had once surrounded him began to fade, but the consequences of his life choices did not disappear. They shifted into quieter, more controlled spaces. By the late 1840s, he was no longer at the center of power. His health was declining, both physically and mentally, and the man who had once moved confidently between Kentucky and Washington was now slowing down. The energy that had driven his long career began to weaken, and with it, the urgency to maintain a carefully balanced public image also diminished. Yet even in this later stage of his life, the absence of Julia Chin remained unaddressed. There was no attempt to formally acknowledge her place in his story, no effort to restore what had already been left out. Instead, the narrative of his life continued to center on his political achievements, his service, and his position in American history. The complexities of his personal life, particularly those that challenged social norms, were allowed to remain in the background, known to some, but not officially recorded, in a way that would preserve them for future generations. When Johnson died in 1850 at the age of 70, the opportunity to define how his life would be remembered passed into the hands of others, and it was in that moment that the process of erasure became something more deliberate. His daughters, with Julia, Imogene, and Adeline, were still alive. They had been given land earlier in life and had married white men, navigating a society that continued to place limits on their acceptance. Despite this, when it came to Johnson's estate, they were excluded from his will. The reasons behind this exclusion were not simply accidental. They were shaped by the same social and racial boundaries that had defined Julia's life, and, by extension, her children's place in the world. After Johnson's death, his surviving brothers, John and Henry Johnson, took control of his papers and personal records. Instead of preserving them, they destroyed many of these documents, letters, records, and materials that could have provided insight into his private life, including his relationship with Julia and their daughters. This was not just an act of neglect, it was a decision that carried clear intent. By removing these records, they removed evidence, evidence of a relationship that complicated the family's public image, evidence of heirs who could potentially challenge the distribution of his estate, evidence of a truth that did not fit within the narrative they wanted to maintain. The legal system, rather than correcting this, became part of the process. A judge supported the claim that Johnson had died without a wife or children, allowing his estate to pass to his brothers instead of to Imogene and Adeline. This official ruling transformed omission into record. It did not just ignore Julia and her daughters, it erased them in a way that carried legal authority. Their existence, once acknowledged in life, was now denied in death. This moment marked a turning point. What had begun as gradual forgetting became structured erasure. The story of Julia Chin was no longer simply overlooked. It was actively removed from the narrative that would define Johnson's legacy. And without documents, without legal recognition, without a place in official history, her life became increasingly difficult to trace, reduced to fragments, to scattered references, to memories that would not survive the passage of time on their own. This was how a life could disappear, not because it lacked meaning, but because it was deliberately pushed out of the record, leaving behind only silence where there had once been a presence that shaped everything around it. What remained after the destruction of records was not just absence, it was distortion. With Richard Mentor Johnson's papers gone, the legal system having formally denied the existence of his relationship with Julia Chin and their daughters, the version of history that survived was incomplete by design. His public legacy continued to be preserved in official records, political accounts, and historical summaries, but it was a version of his life stripped of its most complicated and revealing truths. The woman who had lived beside him, who had managed his household, raised his children, and sustained the foundation that allowed him to pursue power, was no longer part of the narrative. In her place was silence, a silence that made it easier to present a cleaner, more acceptable version of the past. This kind of erasure did not happen loudly. There were no public declarations, no dramatic rewriting of history in a single moment. Instead, it happened quietly, through omission, through the absence of documentation, through the decisions of those who controlled what was kept and what was discarded over time. That silence became normalized. Future generations, relying on the records available to them, encountered a version of events that did not include Julia Chin at all, or if she appeared, it was only in passing, without detail, without context, without recognition of the role she had played. This absence shaped how history was understood. It reinforced the idea that figures like Johnson existed independently, that their achievements were the result of their own actions alone, disconnected from the lives that supported them. It removed the contradictions, the uncomfortable realities, the human complexities that did not fit within a simplified narrative, and in doing so, it ensured that Julia's story would not just be forgotten, it would be unknown. For decades, her life remained in this state, existing only in fragments that were too incomplete to form a full picture. Without consistent records, historians had little to work with, and so the gaps remained unfilled. Her identity became uncertain, her timeline unclear, her experiences reduced to speculation rather than documented fact. It was as if she had been pushed to the edge of history, visible only in shadows, impossible to fully recover. Yet the truth did not disappear entirely. It lingered in scattered references, in overlooked mentions, in pieces of information that had not been completely erased. These fragments waited, unnoticed for years, until eventually they would begin to draw attention again. Researchers, historians, and writers would return to those fragments, questioning the gaps, looking for what had been left out, attempting to reconstruct a story that had been deliberately broken apart, and through that process, Julia Chin would slowly begin to reemerge, not as a complete figure restored in full clarity, but as someone whose life could no longer be entirely ignored. The silence that had once buried her story would begin to crack, allowing pieces of truth to surface once more. And with each piece recovered, the narrative that had excluded her would be challenged, revealing not just her life, but the mechanisms that had worked to erase it in the first place. Decades passed, and for a long time, Julia Chin existed only as a shadow at the edge of recorded history. Her name, when it appeared at all, was brief, uncertain, and often dismissed as a minor detail in the life of a far more prominent man. historians focused on Richard Mentor Johnson's political career, his years in Congress, his role as vice president, his place in shaping early American governance. The deeper, more complicated aspects of his personal life were either softened or ignored altogether. This was not unusual. History, especially in its earlier forms, tended to preserve power while overlooking those who existed outside of it, and Julia, despite everything she had done, had never held power in a way that the system recognized. Without official records, without legal acknowledgement, without a voice preserved in writing, she remained difficult to define. Even the most basic details of her life, her birth, her background, her experiences were unclear, scattered across fragments that did not always align. Some accounts attempted to categorize her, to define her identity in terms of race, suggesting she was mostly of European descent with only a fraction of African ancestry. Others questioned these claims, pointing out the lack of reliable evidence and the tendency of historical narratives to reshape identities in ways that made them more acceptable to later audiences. This uncertainty extended beyond her origins. It affected how she was perceived, how her story was told, and whether it was told at all. In many ways, she became a figure shaped as much by absence as by fact, a person whose life had been real, whose impact had been significant, yet whose existence was difficult to fully reconstruct. Because of this, her story remained incomplete for generations. It appeared in footnotes, in passing references, in small mentions that hinted at something larger but never fully explored it. Scholars who encountered her name often lacked the materials needed to go further. Without documents, without first-hand accounts, without a consistent record, there was no clear path to understanding who she had been or what her life had truly looked like. And so, for a long time, Julia Chinn remained in this uncertain space, acknowledged just enough to be noticed, but not enough to be understood. Her life existed between history and silence, present but not fully recognized, remembered but not fully restored. It would take a shift in how history itself was approached, a willingness to look beyond traditional records, to question what had been omitted, to seek out voices that had been pushed aside before her story could begin to take shape again. And when that shift finally came, it would not just change how Julia Chinn was remembered. It would also reveal how easily entire lives could be erased and how much effort it takes to bring them back into view. It was not until much later, toward the late 20th century, that Julia Chinn's story began to surface again, not as a complete narrative, but as a question that refused to disappear. Historians and researchers, working with fragments that had survived decades of neglect and erasure, started to notice inconsistencies in the accepted version of Richard Mentor Johnson's life. There were references that did not fully align, mentions of daughters that had no clear origin, traces of a household that suggested a presence not officially recorded. These small details, overlooked for years, became the starting point for a deeper investigation. Scholars began to piece together what they could, drawing from scattered documents, local records, and indirect accounts that had escaped destruction. It was not an easy process. The lack of primary sources made every conclusion uncertain, every connection tentative. But even within those limitations, a clearer picture started to form. Julia Chinn was no longer just a name. She was a person whose life intersected directly with one of the most powerful figures of her time. As more attention was given to her story, the nature of that relationship became harder to ignore. It challenged the simplified narratives that had dominated historical writing. It forced a reconsideration of what had been left out, and why researchers began to ask not only who Julia Chinn was, but also how and why her story had been erased in the first place. This shift in focus marked an important change in historical study. It was no longer just about recording the actions of those in power, but about understanding the full context in which those actions took place, including the lives of those who had been excluded from official accounts. Julia's story became part of a broader effort to recover hidden histories, stories of individuals whose experiences had been overlooked, minimized, or deliberately removed from the record. Through this process, more details about her life began to emerge. Her role at Blue Spring Farm, her relationship with Johnson, the existence of her daughters, and the responsibilities she had carried all started to take shape in a more complete way. Each new piece of information added depth, transforming her from a marginal figure into someone central to understanding a larger historical reality. Yet even as her story re-emerged, it remained incomplete. The gaps created by years of erasure could not be fully filled. Some details were lost permanently, leaving historians to work with what remained rather than what once existed. Still, the act of recovery itself carried significance. It demonstrated that even when history is altered, even when records are destroyed, traces can survive enough to challenge the silence that replaced them. Julia Chin's life, once nearly erased, was beginning to return, not fully restored, but no longer invisible. And in that return, there was a quiet but powerful shift, a recognition that her story mattered, not just as a footnote to someone else's life, but as a narrative that revealed deeper truths about power, race, and the way history is shaped. And as that recognition grew, so did the understanding that what had happened to Julia Chin was not an isolated case, but part of a larger pattern, one that had affected countless lives, many of which were still waiting to be rediscovered. As Julia Chin's story slowly reemerged, it did more than just restore a forgotten name. It forced a confrontation with the deeper realities of the world she had lived in. Her life could no longer be dismissed as an anomaly or a minor detail in the shadow of a powerful man. Instead, it became a lens through which historians and readers could examine the contradictions of early American society, a nation that spoke of liberty while sustaining slavery, a system that allowed a man to acknowledge his children but deny their mother freedom, a reality where a woman could hold access, responsibility, influence, and trust, yet still be legally defined as property. Through Julia, these contradictions became personal, no longer abstract ideas but lived experiences. Her story revealed how power operated not just in laws and institutions, but in everyday relationships, in decisions made behind closed doors, in the lives that were shaped and controlled without recognition. It also challenged the way history had traditionally been told. For generations, narratives had centered on figures like Richard Mentor Johnson, men whose actions were documented, whose achievements were recorded, whose legacies were preserved. Julia's reappearance disrupted that pattern. It demanded space for a different kind of history, one that acknowledged the contributions and experiences of those who had been excluded, one that questioned whose stories were considered important and whose were allowed to disappear. At the same time, her story remained incomplete, marked by gaps that could never be fully closed. There were moments of her life that would never be known, thoughts she never had the chance to record, feelings that were lost with her passing. This incompleteness was not a weakness of her story, but a reflection of what had been taken from her, the ability to define her own narrative, to leave behind a record of her own voice. Even so, what had been recovered was enough to change how she was understood. No longer invisible, no longer entirely erased, Julia Chin stood as a figure who could not be ignored. Her life, though fragmented in the historical record, carried weight. It revealed the human cost of a system built on inequality. It exposed the mechanisms of erasure that could remove someone from history, even when their impact had been undeniable. And perhaps most importantly, it showed that recovery was possible, that even after decades of silence, stories could return, not exactly as they once were, but strong enough to challenge what had replaced them. As more attention was given to lives like Julia's, the broader narrative of history itself began to shift. It became more complex, more honest, more willing to confront uncomfortable truths. And in that shift, Julia Chin's story found its place not just as the story of a woman connected to power, but as a story that revealed the limits of that power and the consequences it carried for those who lived within its reach. Even as Julia Chin's story was slowly brought back into the light, what remained most striking was not just what had been recovered, but what had been lost. Entire portions of her life existed only as gaps, spaces where something had once been but could no longer be fully reconstructed. Historians could outline the structure of her existence, identify key events, trace her connection to Richard Mentor Johnson, But the deeper layers, the personal moments, the internal struggles, the way she truly experienced the world around her remained largely unreachable. This absence was not accidental. It was the result of a system that had never intended for her story to be preserved in the first place. As an enslaved woman, Julia had no control over how her life was documented, or whether it would be documented at all. Her voice was never recorded in letters, her thoughts never written in diaries, her perspective never formally acknowledged. What remained instead were fragments filtered through others, through legal records, through accounts written by people who did not share her position, through documents that reflected power rather than experience. This made the process of understanding her life inherently incomplete. Every detail had to be interpreted, every conclusion drawn from limited evidence, every narrative built around what could be known rather than what should have been known. Yet within those limitations, a clearer understanding began to take shape. Julia's life was not just defined by what happened to her, but by how she navigated it. She adapted to a system that denied her freedom, found ways to operate within constraints that could not be broken, and maintained a level of control over her environment that was both remarkable and fragile. At Blue Spring Farm, she had created order in a place that was built on imbalance. She had raised children in a world that offered them no clear place. She had managed responsibilities that far exceeded what her status allowed, all while remaining bound by the same laws that reduced her to property. These contradictions were not just historical details, they were central to understanding who she was and what her life represented. They showed that even within oppressive systems, individuals could exert influence, make decisions, and shape outcomes, even if they could not fully escape the structures that confined them. At the same time, her story highlighted the cost of that influence, the burden of responsibility without recognition, the pressure of maintaining stability without security, the constant awareness that everything she built could be taken away at any moment. These were not abstract ideas, they were realities she lived with every day. And as historians continued to examine her life, these realities became more visible, more difficult to ignore. They challenged simplified narratives, forcing a deeper engagement with the complexities of the past. Julia Chin was no longer just a figure who had been erased. She was a figure who revealed why erasure was possible in the first place. And in that revelation, her story became more than a recovery of one life. It became a key to understanding a much larger pattern, one that extended far beyond her own experience and into the broader structure of history itself. As more attention was given to Julia Chin's life, the physical traces of her world also began to draw interest, not just the story, but the place where it unfolded. Blue Spring Farm, once a functioning plantation and center of daily activity, had long since faded from its original form. Time, neglect, and changing landscapes had altered it beyond recognition in many ways. Yet, not everything had disappeared. There were still remnants, quiet and overlooked, that carried echoes of what had once been. The most notable of these was the structure associated with the Choctaw Academy. The building, though no longer intact, still stood in partial form, stone walls weathered by decades, sections collapsed, overgrown with vegetation that had slowly reclaimed the space where people once lived, studied, and moved with purpose. To an untrained eye, it might appear as nothing more than a ruin, a forgotten piece of land without significance. But to those who understood its history, it represented something far more meaningful. It was a rare, physical connection to Julia Chin's life, a place where her presence had been real, where her responsibilities had taken shape, where her influence had left a mark that could not be entirely erased. Even without records, even without written accounts that fully captured her role, the existence of that structure offered a form of evidence. It confirmed that the world she had inhabited was not imagined, not exaggerated, but real and tangible. Visitors who came to see the site were not just observing a historical location. They were standing in a space that had once been shaped, in part, by someone whose story had nearly been lost. The silence of the place carried weight, the absence of voices, of movement, of the daily life that had once filled it, created a contrast that made its history more striking. It was a reminder that history does not only exist in documents or narratives, it exists in places, in structures, in the physical world that remains long after the people who shaped it are gone. At the same time, the condition of the site reflected the broader reality of Julia's story. It had not been preserved with care. It had not been maintained as a central piece of historical memory. Instead, it had been left to deteriorate, much like the narrative of her life had been allowed to fade. This neglect was not necessarily intentional in every case, but it mirrored the same pattern of overlooking, of allowing certain parts of history to slip away while others were preserved. Over time, however, efforts began to emerge to stabilize what remained. Local preservationists recognized the importance of the site, not just as an architectural relic, but as a connection to a deeper and more complex history. Their work aimed to prevent further loss, to ensure that at least part of what had once existed would endure for future generations. Through these efforts, the physical space associated with Julia Chin gained a new kind of recognition. It was no longer just a forgotten ruin, it became a point of reference, a place where her story could be grounded in something real, something visible, something that could not be easily denied. And in that way, even as much of her life remained incomplete, there was at least one part of it that could still be seen, still be touched, still be remembered in a form that went beyond words. A silent but powerful reminder that she had lived, that she had shaped the world around her, and that despite everything that had been done to erase her, traces of her existence remained rooted in the very ground where her life had unfolded. As the fragments of Julia Chin's life continued to resurface, her story began to shift from something nearly lost into something that demanded acknowledgement. It was no longer just about uncovering a forgotten figure. It became about confronting the reasons she had been forgotten in the first place. The deeper historians looked, the clearer it became that her erasure was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern embedded in the way history had been recorded for generations. Lives like Julia's complex, significant, yet inconvenient to dominant narratives were often minimized or removed entirely. Her story exposed how easily truth could be reshaped when those with the power to preserve it chose instead to control it. This realization gave her life a new kind of weight. She was no longer just connected to a powerful man. She represented the countless individuals whose stories had been altered, reduced, or erased to maintain a more comfortable version of the past. Through Julia, historians could trace the mechanisms of that process: the destruction of records, the manipulation of legal documents, the silence in official accounts, and the gradual normalization of absence. Each of these steps contributed to a version of history that appeared complete, but was, in reality, missing essential parts. As this understanding grew, so did the significance of bringing her story back into view. It was not simply an act of recovery, it was an act of correction, a way to challenge the gaps that had been accepted for too long and to question the reliability of narratives that had gone unexamined. Julia Chin's life became a reminder that history is not fixed. It is shaped by choices: what is recorded, what is preserved, and what is allowed to disappear. And when those choices are revisited, when the overlooked details are re-examined, new truths can emerge that reshape how the past is understood. At the same time, her story carried a quiet tension. Even as it was being rediscovered, it could never be fully restored. The absence created by years of erasure could not be completely undone. There would always be missing pieces, unanswered questions, and moments that could never be recovered. This incompleteness became part of her narrative, a reflection of what had been taken from her not just in life, but in memory. Yet despite those limitations, her presence in history was no longer fragile. It had been reestablished, supported by research, by renewed interest, by a growing recognition of the importance of voices that had once been excluded. Her story now existed not as a footnote, but as a central example of how history can be both constructed and deconstructed. And in that transformation, Julia Chin became more than a figure from the past. She became a symbol of recovery, of resistance against silence, of the idea that even when a life is pushed to the margins, it can still find its way back into the narrative. Her story, once nearly erased, now stood as a reminder that forgetting is not always final, and that what is lost can, with enough effort, be found again. By the time Julia Chinn's story had been partially reconstructed, it no longer existed in isolation. It had become part of a larger conversation about how history is written, preserved, and, at times, manipulated. Her life, once nearly erased, now stood as evidence of something deeper than a single forgotten narrative. It revealed the fragility of historical truth when it depends entirely on those who hold power to record it. The more her story was examined, the more it exposed a pattern that extended far beyond Kentucky, far beyond the Johnson family, and far beyond the early 19th century. Across different times and places, similar stories had followed the same path, lived fully, then reduced, then forgotten. Julia's life became a case study in how that process works in practice. First, there is presence, a real life, with real impact, woven into the fabric of a larger system. Then comes omission, details left out, records minimized, contributions unacknowledged. And finally, erasure, where absence becomes accepted, where what is no longer recorded is treated as if it never existed at all. This pattern was not always the result of a single decision. It was often the accumulation of many small choices, each one removing a piece until there was almost nothing left to see. In Julia's case, those choices were both passive and deliberate. The lack of documentation at her birth, the absence of legal recognition during her life, the destruction of records after Johnson's death, all of these contributed to the disappearance of her story. But what made her case particularly striking was that enough remained to challenge that disappearance. Enough fragments survived to disrupt the silence, to raise questions, to demand answers. And in doing so, her story shifted from being a missing piece to being a revealing one. It showed not only what had happened to her, but how and why it had been hidden. This made her story valuable not just for what it told us about her life, but for what it revealed about the structure of history itself. It demonstrated that history is not simply a collection of facts. It is a constructed narrative, shaped by perspective, by intention, and by the limitations of what is preserved. It also highlighted the responsibility that comes with studying the past, the need to question what is missing, to look beyond official records, to consider whose voices have been excluded, and why Julia Chinn's life became a reminder that the absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence. Sometimes, it is the result of something being deliberately removed, and recognizing that difference is essential to understanding the past more fully. As historians continued to explore her story, it became clear that her significance extended beyond her individual experience. She represented a larger truth about the countless lives that have been shaped by systems of power, yet left out of the narratives that describe them. And in bringing her story back into focus, there was an opportunity not just to restore one life to history, but to rethink how many others might still be waiting in the margins, unseen, unheard, and unrecorded. As Julia Chinn's story gained recognition, it began to resonate beyond academic circles and historical research. It reached a wider audience, people who were not just interested in the past, but in understanding how that past continues to shape the present. Her life, once hidden, now carried a relevance that extended far beyond her time. It raised questions that were still being asked in modern society. Questions about power, about identity, about who gets remembered and who is forgotten. The details of her life, her position within the Johnson household, her role as both enslaved and essential, her children who lived between acceptance and exclusion, reflected dynamics that did not simply disappear with time. They evolved, but their foundations remained recognizable. This made her story more than historical. It made it relatable in ways that were both uncomfortable and necessary. People began to see her not just as a figure from the 19th century, but as a person whose experiences echoed themes that still exist. The idea of contributing to something without receiving recognition, the reality of being visible yet not fully acknowledged, the tension of living within systems that define your value without your consent. These were not distant concepts, they were human experiences that continued to exist in different forms. By bringing Julia Chinn's story into the present conversation, it also challenged how history is taught and understood. Traditional narratives often focus on major events, on well-known figures, and clear timelines that create a sense of order. But stories like Julia's disrupt that order. They introduce complexity, contradiction, and perspectives that do not fit neatly into established frameworks. They require a different kind of engagement, one that is willing to sit with uncertainty, to accept incomplete information, and to recognize that some truths are not easily categorized. This shift in perspective is significant because it changes not just what we know about history, but how we approach it. It encourages a more critical view, one that looks beyond surface-level accounts and seeks to understand the deeper structures that shape them. Julia Chin's life, in this context, becomes more than a recovered narrative. It becomes a tool for questioning, for re-examining assumptions, for recognizing the limitations of what has been traditionally accepted as complete. At the same time, her story carries an emotional weight that cannot be ignored. It is not just about systems or patterns, it is about a real person who lived, struggled, adapted, and ultimately disappeared without acknowledgement. The recognition she receives now does not change what she experienced, but it changes how those experiences are understood. It gives them visibility, it gives them context, and perhaps most importantly, it gives them a place within a larger narrative that is still being written. As more people engage with her story, it continues to evolve, not in terms of changing facts, but in terms of expanding understanding. Each new perspective adds depth. Each new discussion brings new insight, and through that process, Julia Chin's life remains active within the conversation, not as something fixed in the past, but as something that continues to influence how we see both history and ourselves. As the full weight of Julia Chin's story settles in, what remains is not just a reconstruction of her life, but a confrontation with the silence that surrounded it for so long. Her story forces a shift in perspective from asking what happened to asking why it was allowed to disappear in the first place. Because the truth is, Julia Chin was never truly invisible. She lived at the center of a powerful man's world. She raised his children, managed his estate, sustained the structure that supported his rise. Her presence was real, constant, and undeniable. And yet, despite all of that, history found a way to move forward without her. That is what makes her story so unsettling. It reveals that visibility does not guarantee remembrance, that significance does not ensure preservation, that a life can matter deeply in its own time and still be erased from the narrative that follows. This realization extends beyond Julia herself. It applies to countless others whose lives were shaped by systems that did not value their stories enough to record them. It challenges the assumption that history, as it is written, is complete or even balanced. Instead, it exposes it as selective, shaped by power, influenced by perspective, and limited by what is chosen to be kept or discarded. In this way, Julia Chin's story becomes more than a recovery of one life. It becomes a warning, a reminder that what we accept as history is not always the full picture, that behind every well-documented figure, there may be others whose contributions remain hidden, whose experiences were never given the same importance, and that without deliberate effort, those stories can remain lost indefinitely. At the same time, her rediscovery offers something else: possibility. The possibility that gaps can be questioned, the possibility that silence can be challenged, the possibility that even after years of absence, a story can return strong enough to change how we understand the past. Julia Chin's life, once nearly erased, now stands as proof of that. It shows that history is not fixed, that it can be revisited, re-examined, and expanded to include what was once left out. But it also reminds us that this process is not automatic. It requires attention, it requires effort, it requires a willingness to look beyond what is already known and ask what might be missing. And as her story continues to be told, shared, and examined, it carries forward that responsibility not just to remember Julia Chin, but to recognize the many others whose stories have yet to be recovered. Because in the end, her life is not just about the past, it is about how we choose to remember, how we choose to record, and how we choose to give meaning to the lives that history once tried to leave behind. In the end, Julia Chin's story does not conclude with a clear resolution or a sense of justice restored. It does not offer the kind of closure that history sometimes promises. Instead, it leaves behind something quieter, More unsettling a recognition that her life was shaped by forces she could never fully escape, and remembered only because fragments of it survived against the odds. She was born without a recorded date, lived without legal identity, and died without a marked grave. For decades, her existence lingered on the edge of being completely forgotten. And yet, despite all of that, her story endured, not in full, not in perfect detail, but in pieces strong enough to resist total erasure. Those pieces, once overlooked, now form a narrative that challenges how we understand both her life and the world she lived in. Julia Chin was not a figure of power in the traditional sense. She did not hold office, did not write laws, did not leave behind documents in her own voice. But her influence was real. She shaped a household, raised children who carried forward a complicated legacy, and supported a man whose political career would place him among the most recognized figures of his time. Her life existed at the intersection of personal and political, private and public, visible and invisible, and it is within that intersection that her story gains its significance, because it reveals how much of history exists outside official recognition, how many lives contribute to outcomes without ever being acknowledged, how systems of power depend not only on those who lead, but on those who are never given credit for sustaining them. Julia's story forces us to reconsider what it means to matter in history. It suggests that importance is not defined solely by what is recorded, but also by what is experienced, by what is lived, by what shapes events even when it is not formally recognized. Her life, though fragmented in the historical record, carries a presence that cannot be dismissed. It lingers in the questions it raises, in the gaps it exposes, in the truths it reveals about the nature of memory and omission, and perhaps that is where her story finds its lasting impact, not in a definitive ending, but in its ability to continue influencing how we think about the past. It invites us to look more closely, to question more deeply, to recognize that what is missing can be just as important as what is present. Julia Chin may not have been given a place in history during her lifetime, but in being rediscovered, she has become part of something larger, a shift toward a more complete and honest understanding of the past, one that acknowledges not only the figures who were meant to be remembered, but also those who were not. And in that acknowledgement, her story finds a form of recognition that was denied to her in life, a recognition that does not change what she endured, but ensures that it is no longer invisible. What remains after everything is not just the story of Julia Chin, but the weight of what her life represents. A life lived in contradiction, seen but not recognized, trusted but not freed, central yet erased. Her existence forces a question that lingers long after the details fade. How many others lived the same way, shaped history in quiet ways, only to disappear from it completely? Julia Chin's story is not rare. That is what makes it powerful. It is one example among many, a single thread in a much larger fabric of lives that were never fully recorded. The difference is that her story survived just enough to be recovered, just enough to be told again, just enough to challenge the silence that replaced it. And in that survival, there is something important, not closure, not resolution, but awareness. Awareness that history is incomplete. Awareness that what we know is only part of what existed. Awareness that behind every official narrative, there may be countless others waiting to be uncovered. Her life also reframes the way we look at power. Richard Mentor Johnson is remembered as vice president, a man who held influence at the highest level of government. His name appears in records, in books, in accounts of American history. Julia Chin does not appear in the same way. Yet without her, without the structure she maintained, the life she sustained, the responsibilities she carried, his story would not look the same. This does not diminish his achievements, but it complicates them. It reveals that no life exists in isolation, that even the most powerful figures are supported by others whose contributions are not always visible. Julia's story makes that invisible support visible. It gives form to what history often leaves out, and in doing so, it changes how we understand both her life and his. It shifts the focus from individual achievement to interconnected existence, from isolated narratives to shared realities. At the same time, her story reminds us of the limits of recovery. Not everything can be brought back. The years of silence, the destroyed records, the absence of her own voice, these cannot be undone. There will always be parts of her life that remain unknown, details that can only be imagined, moments that are permanently lost. This is part of her story as well, not just what was lived, but what was taken, what was never allowed to remain. And yet, even within those limits, her presence endures, not as a complete picture, but as a powerful outline clear enough to be recognized, strong enough to be remembered. Julia Chinn's life does not end with her death. It continues in the questions it raises, in the conversations it inspires, in the way it reshapes our understanding of history. And in that continuation, there is a kind of meaning that goes beyond recognition. It becomes part of how we see the past, how we interpret it, how we choose to remember, and perhaps that is the closest thing to justice her story can offer, not a correction of what happened, but a refusal to let it remain hidden a second time. In the end, Julia Chinn's story does not demand sympathy as much as it demands attention, not because her life was tragic, though it was, but because it reveals something deeper about the way the world remembers and forgets. She was never meant to be remembered. Not in the system she was born into, not in the society she lived in, and not in the version of history that followed. Her existence challenged too many boundaries: race, power, ownership, identity, and so it was easier to let her disappear. But disappearance is not the same as absence, and Julia Chinn was never truly absent. She was there in the structure of a household that functioned because of her, there in the lives of children she raised, there in the success of a man who depended on the stability she maintained. Her presence was real, even if it was never officially recorded. That is what gives her story its lasting force. It reminds us that history is not just about what is written down, it is about what actually happened. And those two things are not always the same. There are lives that shape events without leaving records. There are people who carry entire systems on their shoulders without ever being acknowledged. Julia Chinn was one of them. And now, by telling her story, by bringing her back into the narrative, something changes. Not the past remains exactly as it was, but the way we understand it shifts. It becomes less certain, less complete, more honest. Her story creates space for doubt, for questioning what else might be missing, what other names have been left out, what other lives have been reduced to silence. It turns history from a fixed record into something more dynamic, something that can be re-examined and expanded. And in that space, Julia Chinn exists again, not as a shadow, not as a rumor, not as a footnote, but as a life that mattered, a life that endured, a life that, despite every effort to erase it, found its way back. And maybe that is the most powerful part of her story, not how it began, not even how it ended, but the fact that it did not stay buried, that after everything, the silence, the loss, the erasure, her name can still be spoken, her life can still be told. And in that telling, she is no longer invisible, she is no longer forgotten, she is no longer erased.